Hello, hello. I hope all of you are enjoying the conference so far. I think it's a super well-organized conference, I have to say. So my name is Farmar. I work for particular software. We do N-Service Bus. Anybody here knows N-Service Bus? 1 or 2, 3, 10 people. Great. So we do software for developers, for systems, for anything to do with messaging and message queues and that kind of context. I've been doing distributed systems for the last kind of 12 years. Been in industry for a while. You can see my salt and pepper hair, yeah? More salt and pepper. But I've been around for a while. And I'm going to talk about today is the biggest problem we have when we get stuck with monoliths. So we build this system and we end up in this position where it's not maintainable anymore. So how can we, what is the other proposition, or what is the other way we can go about decomposing our monolith and hopefully doing a better design. The update user means nothing to me. I'll talk about it a little bit later. But that's a little anecdote. But I presume most of us have update user in the system, yeah? What's the problem with update user? It does everything, right? It's an atomic operation that has totally no context. And usually, initially it works really well, but then after more and more business operations are added, then update user becomes a huge 10,000 rows, okay, I'm exaggerating, 1,000 rows of a class that has loads of if-else case statements, switches, and all kind of funky stuff. So that is that kind of, we don't want to get there, right? So let's talk about traditional software design. I know you're all beyond that, but in my days, that's how we started. We kind of analyzed the domain. We looked at our users. We asked the business, what are they doing? We created this data model, right? This big data model on big charts on the walls, and we added, all the entities that are playing in this domain. And then we added the relationship dependencies based on rational rows or all kind of techniques that show that this has a dependency on that, and this does this to that, and orders and rows and items and products and so on and so forth. So we ended up with something like this. And when we look at it, first iterations, that's super snazzy, very clean, very nice, describes the domain very well. This might be a bit more complicated, or this kind of looks a bit more realistic. And then we built the database, right, and the data models, and we go, oh, great, now let's do the, all our data layer operations. We do CRUD operations, create, update, delete, and we then add another layer on top of that so we can have some business logic, right? So, if you update a user, what are you going to do? And then on top of that, we build a UI. And I think that's when the problem starts, right? We look at it and we go, oh, hold on. When we do this, we need to do that, and when we need to do that, we need to do the other. And we start pulling everything into our code, into many layers. We try to keep it clean, right? So we have like this business layer, UI layer, service layers, anti-corruption layers. I can go on all day. Those layers introduce more complexity, and they hide the really dirty stuff underneath, right? And we end up with a huge problem because we are every time we want to display a screen or an item on the UI, or we want to do some operation, we actually do a user, like a user.get, right? And put some predicate in there. And then what actually happens in the background is we pull up the whole database into to memory, whether it's usually on the server side. And then from that, we kind of either pull the whole thing onto the UI, or we just pull partial stuff to the UI. As we continue doing that, it gets really, really ugly. And there's always this thing with business. I don't know why they do this, but they always do this, yeah? As we finish, just, we're done with this project or this iteration, and we're really happy with our design, they go, oh, just one more thing, can you do this one little thing to, can we validate the email when a user registers? We didn't do this back then. We didn't tell you about it, but now we really need it because we have to know who the user is. And also, send them a registration, a welcome mail. And can we do some integrations with Salesforce? Is that all right? Anybody did integration with Salesforce? It's so lovely. Such warm experience. And so we end up with this huge big ball of mud, yeah? We built this humongous model, loads of code, and we end up with this everything, calling everything from all kind of layers in all kind of direct and indirect options. Some of you have been juniors and then been seniors, have probably seen it, where the juniors come in to the legacy app or the legacy system, and they try to fix their first bugs, or first feature, and they look at this shit, excuse my language, and they go, forget it, I'm just going to go from the UI directly to the database and forget all the rest, right? Done that? Been there? I've done it a couple of times at least, and thought that was great because I was bypassing all that. So what do we do in this situation? Hack it, like I just mentioned, yeah? Refactor it. Can you refactor your way out of a monolith? The lights here are shocking. You can. Okay. One or two people, brave people here. Redesign. The question redesign is great, right? Because this is something that you look at and you say, now I know the domain, yeah? Now I know my system, I know all the mistakes I've done. I'll redesign it, right? But what are you going to introduce? The same thing that we just did 3 years ago, yeah? And ended up in this situation? Anybody for that? Yeah? Anybody thinks that they can take the current system, redesign it using the same kind of methodology and get a better result? No one brave here. Everybody's smart. So, the last option, of course, is a rewrite, right? Anybody did that in the last year or so? Go to the manager and went, we need to rewrite. This is all shite. And we need to go and rebuild this whole thing, and now we'll do it better. We'll get the best team on the company, and we rewrite this. Anybody did this successfully? One or two. Geez, you're lucky. I've done it so many times in my life, in different versions, of course. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm smart. But I did it again and again and ended up in the same result. It was always something like, it's going to take 9 months, and it actually took 3 years. The data migration meant that we need to take off the system for like, I don't know, ridiculous amount of time. It wasn't days, it was like weeks, yeah, in order to get like the whole system. Now I'm talking about systems being in production and being used, yeah, so it was like terabytes of data, warehouses, crazy stuff, right? Don't rewrite. Please do yourself a favor. forget this option. It's a fallacy. You know, whatever you do, you're chasing after your tail as a business, or freeze the business. And if you can freeze the business, you should probably leave, yeah, because it means that the business is not, you know, is not viable business. If a business relies on your software to live every day, they'll have change requests every week, or every month, or every day. So don't rewrite. What I'm trying to propose here is maybe a way to redesign, but to rethink or change the paradigm around how we build software, and kind of take it to the kind of more decomposition kind of route. And to help with that, I want to introduce what everybody here, I presume, knows about, is DDD, domain-driven design. Anyone doesn't know DDD? Or a couple of people here. Okay, so I'll give you a quick kind of thing about DDD. Domain-driven design was introduced around 2003 by Eric Evans. He wrote a book, the Blue Book, and it's all about how to take a big commercial domain and break it apart, finding the entities, finding the aggregate roots, understanding the business, building a ubiquitous language, finding the boundaries, finding context and bounds, the boundaries around this context, and making better software design. The only problem with this book was that everybody read the first bit. Anybody read the Blue Book, DDD? It's a hard book to read. And when you finish the first bit, it sounds like very much like just build entities and get the entities kind of with the right relationships and everything will be fine. And if you don't read the second bit of the book, you miss the point, which I did initially as well. This is exactly what I did. I went on and built beautiful models with behaviors inside, you know, kind of borrowing from object-oriented design, and ended up again with the big ball of mud because there was no significant change in the concept that I approached it. However, the second part of the book is very, very interesting because it talks more about the strategy around how to break the domain down and understand and how to achieve cohesion and encapsulation using this concept of bounded context. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to try kind of dig into the bounded context concept and see if we can make that work for us. So one of his better, I guess, quotes is like, every software program relates to some activity or interest of its user. Anybody here write software for machines? IoT stuff, yeah? Do you treat IoT as your user, or is it just a thing? No answer. So I presume it's a machine. So one of the central things about our work is that we are trying to help our users, our customers, our paying customers, to make better decisions or make their lives easier or make their business work better. And if we're here just to write software, as we do I love to build systems, we end up with the wrong thing. It's not what the user asked for, it is what we want to build, right? If we, like the latest framework, we want to build something with Docker, or we want to build something with this or the other using the cloud functions and so on and so forth. And this is building systems. This is not about, if the user needs to log in and you need to provide one screen, you don't need to build a whole system behind it. It's enough to build up a website with one screen and a small database, and it will work. It's mostly there for you. So having the user in the center of all this is extremely important, because it's the user that's going to interact with our software. It's the user who's going to do the thing that's going to make the software work, and then the software is going to do something and respond, and so on and so forth. So user-centric thinking, at least. Something happened to there. Martin Fowler also said that, you know, by dividing different boundary contexts, and we were able to determine their interrelationships and find their boundaries. So anybody did microservices here? And ended up with a big ball of distributed mud? A couple, yeah? So that's, you know, if you don't have your bounded context and you don't have your boundaries between the things that you distribute, you end up with a big ball of distributed mud, and that hurts. So context. Context is like, you know, what makes things mean what they are, okay? If I take a piece of, you know, a step in a workflow, just relating to it as a step has nothing. It's again, it's like it's a void declaration. It's something going like, oh, I'm doing a step, and what is that step? I don't know. I'm stepping. I'm stepping again. And if I don't put the context around it, saying, you know, like I'm going from a workflow step of this type to that type, I have so much time, I'm going to do these other actions behind it and after it and over it, I have some state, I need to think about the future, whatever. This step is going to repeat. This step is of a certain, you know, in the context of the system does all these things, then step in a workflow means nothing. And many people would tend to build, including myself, like the example of item in a CMS. So I had a database for my CMS, my content management system. This was back in the 90s, so don't forgive me. And in this database, I had an item and a type. And I had this whole relational thing, you know, self-referencing thing, of an item of type of item of type, and each type of item had an item of the item of the type, yeah? And it worked really, really well, but there was zero context around it, yeah? If you were looking at the data, you had to go select the type and the item of the item's type of the type of the item's type, and okay, not funny. So again, an update user is probably the contextless thing again, because what happened, what caused this user to create an update is it will say nothing. You can look at the data, right? You can look at the user's data inside, and then you'll say, oh, if I compare it to the current data set, I can tell that the user changed his name, or the user changed his phone number or his email. But you'll have to really dig into the actual data and not but still doing it with zero context. Yeah, and then this whole thing of race conditions between my current state and the correct state. If anybody does distributed systems here, he knows about eventual consistency. So the current state is almost unknown unless you know where to go, right? Unless you know who can tell you that this is the current state. So in that context, doing an update user is totally useless, yeah, because you don't know what state are you even updating. So just to kind of give it context, it would be create user phone number, or update user phone number, or update user email, or address, or payment method, and so on and so forth. So that hopefully gives some context to that. And boundary is another thing, another substantial thing, which is what belongs where, and where does that thing operate. So in the context, a boundary is what I own. It's the thing that I totally have all the authority to act on. From like service-oriented architecture perspective, that would be, I am the authority of that component. I'm the authority of creating a phone number for a user, or creating a user, creating an account, creating a payment method, and so on. So it's my sole responsibility, and I'm the single one in the system that has this responsibility, and therefore I could be the authority over that action or that operation, which means that I have the ability to be 100% sure that if I change something in that boundary, the effects that I'm expecting will actually be the correct effects, and not some side effects, like updating the update user method might cause all kind of ripple effects all over the system because we forgot that something else is happening, or we have another similar update user method somewhere else, which doesn't exactly do what we do. So we're talking about centralized business logic and stuff like that. So again, if I own that piece of functionality or that piece of domain or data, then I am the only one responsible in the system to make changes, to change the state, to do something meaningful around it. And my boundaries mean that nobody else can affect me outside my boundaries. Yeah. So the only thing other components around me can do is say, "Oh, can you please do this?" Or "This event happened. Please do this." So I will decide to do these other things. And outside this boundary, I have once things step out of this boundary, I have no kind of impact from other components or from other contexts. And obviously, once we have those boundaries, it means that everything is in one place, that I can, I'm ready, I'm encapsulated, and I'm very ready to change and to make changes to the behavior. So bounded context would be those two things together. I have a lot of context, so I have an explicit name. It's very clear to understand from my name or from my messages, from my APIs. This is what I do as a component. And the model is very simple to understand. So from the outside world, it looks very, very clear as to what I'm doing. The other thing is that the bounded context means that we are looking at an action that is very well defined. Yeah. So all these things that are bounded together, yeah, they're glued together, they belong together. You can't put them outside of that context, of that bounded context. For example, if you create an account for a user, there is those 5 fields that you need in order to create the account. We'll talk about it later. Those fields are the bounded context, yeah? I can't take one of the fields and put them somewhere else and still have a meaningful operation done, or if I change that somewhere else, bad things will happen. So the missing bit here, or the missing link here, is that there is a business process behind this bounded context, yeah? So it also implies data, and it also implies state. So it means that in a bounded context, I will have some kind of business process where I am doing something to data or to state and modifying that state. And then I could produce events or do some other things in order to communicate that my state has changed. But the most important thing here is that there is a business process. There is something that drives the need for this thing to be there and to live. So following the bounded context properties or concept, the things that are important is to be explicit, yeah? So if you give it a good name, it is self-explanatory what this component does. If you keep it clean, which means don't try to do things you don't need to do inside this component, things will work better. And very important to keep those boundaries. So remember, everything that you put into this context belongs in there. If it doesn't quite belong in there and you feel a pull, like, oh, I want to have this other field over here because I always want to read from it and then maybe want to modify it, and instead of doing it, I'm constantly trying to reach out, maybe that field belongs into, that piece of data belongs in your component. Anybody know Karate Kid? No? Okay, so that joke doesn't work. Wax on, wax off comes from Karate Kid, from this concept of, you know, when you come to your master and you're a young Jedi, and you go like, hey, I want to go build systems, and they go, sit over there and, you know, drink your porridge and do this very boring task of opening an issue, going into Git, getting the thing, and just fix this one little bug. And you go, no, but I want to go build systems. And he says, just wax on, wax off, you know, just move your thing this way, get your balance, understand the domain, understand how things work, learn the SDLC, all that, you know. That's wax on, wax off. It's like very counterintuitive to us, so that was the joke. Bad one. So basically what wax on, wax off, let's look at how this thing might be a little bit more in action. Now, I'm sorry, I know you all love code and all that. There's no code in this presentation, so it's all about concepts, so bear with me. So for example, we look at a basic unit of work. A user wants to log in or to authenticate in our system. In traditional systems, what would you have? You'd have a user, right? A huge user table. Anybody has a huge user table? With like, yeah, loads of columns, right? Everything with the preferences and the address, or maybe not the address so much, but you know, 3 emails. And every time we have another piece of functionality, what do? We add another column, right? Just another thing to add to the user table. And what do we do when we log in? When a user wants to log in, where do we get the data about the user? From the user table, right? So we load all the user table up into memory in order to get what? The credentials, right? We just want the email, the username or the email, and the password or password hash and the salt for that. And instead we load this. Now, is the user table actually loaded by itself? Who does repositories here? iRepository thing. Oh, a lot, yeah. So what comes when I go user.get? All the dependencies. But even if you're lazy loading and all that, you're still getting all the graph, right? Agreed? So instead, I'm suggesting, you know, we just, in this table that I'm using for authentication, I'm going to have only the username and the password, maybe password hash. And what do I do with the access control at this stage? Let's say the distributed system, it's loads of stuff all around. Do you think we need to have a centralized authorization that is about permissions? You know, what am I allowed to do, not allowed to do? Who says yes? Centralized permission set. A couple. Who says no? A couple more. So it's a great question because authorization has nothing to do with authentication, right? It's later down the line when you want to do something, there is, again, context. And in that context, you want to figure out if you're allowed to do it or not, right? Don't confuse it with the UI. UI is a different, it's a composition. UI composes all this stuff, yeah? So let's go on to the next kind of concept. Or again, contact details. We usually have a lot of contact details, right? But are they the same when we go from, when I do an order, or when I want to read a newsletter, or subscribe to your feed, or when I just come in and I want to, I log in and I want to get, or I will get an email notification, or when you send me an invoice. Are they all the same? All the same? Similar? Different contexts? Buyers, a little bit of different context buyers, yeah? So the concept is that when you deal with contact details for a customer, you actually have a context, yeah? So when you're going to sell him stuff, it would be in the sales context. When you're going to make him an offer, it will be in the sales context or marketing context. When you do stuff around logging, so if I log in, yeah, when I want to authenticate against the system and I want to make sure this user is his email is correct for the authentication purpose, that is a totally different context, yeah? Does that make sense? And then you're going to cry out, data duplication, right? There isn't data duplication here because in the context of sales, I have a certain information, you have certain information about the user. The good example for that is if I do shipping and billing, right? Shipping is where I want this thing to arrive. Does that have to be my home? Maybe it's my kid's home. Maybe it's my work. Maybe I'm here in a hotel for 3 days. I want it here right now, yeah? So shipping details doesn't have to do anything with my home address details where I want my invoice or my business details where I want my invoice, okay? And so there is data duplication if you amalgamate all the data and say I have a user, a single entity, then yes, there will be, you're going to be duplicating the user table 3 times because you want it once in this context, once in this context. But alternatively, I'm suggesting you just take those customer details, put them in the correct context, and you will have different pieces of data in different contexts, okay? And again, coming back to the validation thing, if I have a process whereby when I create an account or when I have two-factor authentication, I need to receive a text message in order to get a code to validate my mobile or validate that me is me, or at least that. It doesn't mean that I give you permission to your salespeople to call me up, right? This is me authenticating that me is me and that I hold this phone number or whatever, but I don't give you this. It's not in the context of somebody calling me, yeah? So just to be clear. So again, we can go through all that through customer account and payment details, through payment methods and all these contexts that make things different, and they all matter. What are you actually doing with this data and what this data means from a user interaction perspective? The important thing, I think, is to look at those data points or data fields as the data, the context data, the bounded context data, rather than an entity, okay? Rather than this thing that describes a thing in the real world, a user or a address or and instead look at it and say, oh, this is the authentication component. It has this data that we're using to authenticate a user. It's the only place in the system, that has this kind of information in that context. Okay? If I want to know what the user's email address is, I will not go to the authentication component and take the email address out of it, just because it might be the email that the user logged in with. Because if I want to contact him, I'll have to find the context that it belongs to. So if I want to send him some marketing information, I need to find the contact details for marketing. I hope that makes sense. And one thing to kind of complete this concept or this paradigm is the process. So there are a lot of things that are conceptual, and they don't live in entities. Yeah? So a stock, for example. Is there an entity called stock in your system? Stock it's not a real thing, right? Stock is a concept. It's this thing that, oh, I have 3 warehouses and I have this whole methodology and system to kind of move things around and order new stock and put the stock and store the stock and store it in a certain way so it stays forever. If I'm doing it with groceries, for example, that's a whole different nightmare. And the same for warehouse. Warehouse is a concept, it's a process. It's something that one component does a little bit of that, thing about adding stock or removing stock to begin with, and then adding stock on another component, and another one does the ordering of the stock, another one does the shipping, or not the shipping, moving the stock into our warehouses. And then when it appears in the warehouse, then another component will go, oh, I have a new piece of stock here. I can hold it in my hand. Please add it to the stock count component that allows the users to know that they can order this thing when they look on the website, like IKEA or something. There is 3 items in stock in Dublin. Yeah? But it's not a single thing. There isn't a single thing of stock and warehouse. And I'm sure there's a lot of other good examples around it. So process sometimes is outside the bounded context. Sometimes it is something that we can talk about and we can figuratively imagine that it's there, but there is no technical component or technical authority that actually does this one thing. And that comes back to kind of centralized business logic, yeah? So centralized business logic sounds great until you start changing the business logic and those changes apply system-wide, and there you're in trouble. So think about it. I'm not going to get into it right now. At any rate, when we go about building stuff and we kind of guess, we're doing a lot of guesswork, right? We look at, and we say this belongs here and this belongs here. We are doing our best effort to make it work, right? So don't expect it to be perfect, yeah? So be ready for change, coming back to what we talked about, one of the properties of those bounded contexts components, is that it's not going to be perfect, and you need to change it all the time, and you need to be open and disown it, yeah, in that manner. You don't need to be right. You need to be correct. You need to be smart about it, yeah. You need to be able to, that's cool. I just made a horrible mistake. This field belongs in a totally different thing. I need to be ready to lift everything, move it over there, and refactor this whole thing. The beauty of it is that this kind of refactoring has very small side effects, yeah? Because we're talking about autonomous components that do specific things. If I move something from one place to another or add something somewhere else and stop processing it in another thing, the side effects are minimal. The side effects are very, very small and very easy to deal with. So I'll kind of try and think about, how would you go about vertically slicing your huge monolith. And And usually people, what do they do first when they start creating a table or creating a class? What the first thing do you do? Give it a name, right? So we give it a name, and this is the first thing I'd urge you to not do, yeah? So first, give it a color. Call it a Godzilla, I don't know what. Do this, non-committal thing, and say, this is the blue box and the green box and the orange and purple and red boxes where I put stuff, yeah? I put all the things that belong together. And then I go, oh, I have user authentication thingy going on. I'll put it in the blue box, and I'll have this little bit of data over there for that. Then I continue progressing, and this is like the customer account stuff. When I create a customer account, what am I going to do? I'm going to use this, account concept. I'm going to store some data about it, and persist it. And what do I do when I create an account? I publish an event to say, hey, listen, system, I just created an account. Here is the ID. And I might have passed some context around to make sure that the REST system can relate to it. And so on and so forth. We go into payments. So, every time a payment is, I have a payment log, one thing, and payment method is totally a different thing, right? But they kind of belong together, don't they? Yeah, they're the same kind of boundary, I guess, the same thing. And again, customer contact details, my customer address, my customer phone, my customer, the other things that have to do with the contact details, my preferences, and so on and so forth. Again, in a real domain, you'd find much better than names than what I did here. This is really shitty, yeah? This is like the very basic, shitty first draft, I call this. This is just to illustrate simply what we do. And customer billing would, for example, contain contact details, right, for customer billing address. And it's interesting because this billing thing is really, really hard because you actually need to do it in the you have to some reference in the order maybe and so on. Think about it. It's really funky. So, but initially I'll put it there. So what am I going to do with the customer shipping address? Suggestions? Another component. Okay. But does it belong in like the shipping thing, or is it the order thing, or is it the invoicing thing? I don't know, right? So basically, I don't know. I'm going to put it in the, I don't have a color, yellow service, and do this thing, or yellow component, and build its own thing, and maybe later I'll have to refactor it. But the concept is that we end up with this vertically sliced, as you can see, components that own their data. They're quite explicit about what they're doing. They don't know about the rest of the components of the system, don't have real dependencies. The only thing that I'd say about that is that they might need to read some data from somewhere, read, not modify, read. And that is a totally different, that's a whole different discussion. But we tend not to share data, definitely not to share data for modifications, yeah? So if I want to create a customer account, I'm not going to go to the user authentication service and ask for the user ID, yeah? I got it in a message from somewhere, yeah? I never am going to ask for that. I'm not going to access its data directly, and I'm definitely not going to be modifying the authentication service data directly, okay? Just to be very clear here. Those boundaries are meant to be totally kept clean and isolated, okay? So how would you go about moving from the big monolith to something like that? So rewrite, I said before, and I hope you listened. And please think about it again if you think I'm wrong. Don't rewrite. So you have a big system and you need to start off with this kind of experiment somewhere, right? One of the ideal places to do it is like your email component. Do you send emails? Anybody? Everyone, right? Most of us send emails. It's a great place to start because sending emails is like this thing that it's a technical component, right? It's something that doesn't belong in a domain. But every time we kind of prepare an email, there is a context. There's a lot of context, actually, yeah? And that's interesting. That could be very interesting to see two things. One is to look at what belongs in the domain in this activity and what doesn't belong in the domain. So email is a great example of a technical component. This is something outside bounded contexts, yeah? This is something, the integration with another system. Your SMTP email, integration with third parties, providers for payments, for documents, document signing, PDF generation, invoice generation, all that, yeah? So kind of carve out those, start somewhere and start carving it out. And do your best to kind of introduce APIs at every level that you can so you can slowly cut away stuff and hide it from the your external dependencies so they don't, they're not affected by the fact that you just changed those two components into 2 or 3 or 10 or whatever, okay? And every time you do this iteration, include the data in that, okay? So start with the database, with the data, where the data belongs, find your data, and do that. Find the bounded context by actions. Again, if a user wants to change something, or a user is doing some action, this action is a call for you to find where does that action belong, and based on that, find the bounded context in which you operate. And when you are dealing with bounded contexts, try to reduce them to the minimum. Yeah. So throw out everything that doesn't belong there. It might belong in another component. You don't want to be dragging in stuff just because you think it belongs there. And finding the service boundaries is a process. You know, it's something that you need to iteratively do again and again until you get better at it. And you will find, you know, it's when you start finding it and things work, it's really cool. It's really, you know, it's a really good feeling. Generally speaking, there's nothing left outside. So you won't be, you know, having, when you're done or when you're in a you have your good boundaries, you won't have anything that's like all of a sudden this doesn't belong anything. It's like, can you imagine like taking a car apart and then putting it back together and finding a screw? It's lovely, isn't it? It's say, oh, I have to take everything back apart, and same idea, okay? And IT ops, this concept of what we talked about, like email component, providers, all these things, they're not your domain. That's why you went out to, unless you build your own SMTP server, unless you own the ISP or those kind of things, if it's not your domain, put it outside your domain, make it explicit that this is a component that I'm using, a provider that I'm using, and we call it IT ops, call it whatever you want, but it's outside your service boundaries and it does technical stuff. You could still use bounded context techniques there, but it's not it's not something you want to bring into your domain. And some other kind of rules, if you wish. So loose coupling outside the boundary. So everything that, you know, once you need to, you feel that you need to do a RESTful call to some other service between components and all that, there is something wrong, yeah? Because it shouldn't be there. You shouldn't have dependencies outside your boundary. Inside your boundary, you want the cohesion, you want high coupling for things to work properly, yeah? So every time inside the boundary, I create a user, I have to authenticate it, all these things belong together. They need to be, there needs to be high coupling there, or tight coupling. And another really important thing is data ownership, and that is like, it sounds crazy when you look at a monolith model, but I want to tell you that every component needs to have its own data, and it's the only one in the system that can modify this data. I'm not talking about reads. Reads are a different story. But generally speaking, explicitly speaking, you cannot have any other component in the system updating the same piece of data, okay? It's really important. When you're done, when you have this, there is this other problem, I guess, and that is your UI, yeah, your APIs, things that are outside the kind of the space of the distributed system or distributed domain, and that's where you introduce UI composition. So, for example, on your UI, it might look like, I don't know if you've seen Amazon, eBay, Google, it seems like everything is like it's one space, right, on in front of your face. But effectively what's happening is that, there's a lot of little bits inside the UI that call different services and get their data or submit information to different services. But for you, it all looks, on the UI, it all looks kind of composite. It looks cohesive. Same for API. Sometimes you work with external APIs and you will need to hide the complexity of your different services, different actions and all that, and show very crude-like API. And it's fair enough. It depends on your consumers, yeah? But inside, you should keep those, avoid data composition or model composition. I'm going to quickly talk about read models, and it's a concept that is a bit advanced to kind of introduce in, but generally speaking, state in a distributed system is something, we all talk about eventual consistency and all that. State is what that component or that bounded context just created, right? So you have my state, my internal state, it's like my memory, if you wish, and which nobody cares about. It's not important for anyone. It's just for me to know that this user has moved from this status to that status, or that order has shipped, or whatever. But there is this external view, or this view, what I call like read models or view models. These are where the eventual consistency ends, okay? So this is the place that would most likely look like the reporting database or something like that. It's where, if you want to know something about an order, you'll go to that view model, that Radis, give me names of distributed caches, whatever, that is backed up by a real database, but this is the real data, okay? The business don't care about my internal state. The business care about the real state, the state that is, I just said that this order has been shipped. So this is a whole topic. I don't want to get into it too heavy. So the only message I want to kind of reiterate here is that one of the basic things here is to let go of entities, yeah? To just let go of the concept that a user is this one thing in your system. A user, once you distribute your system based on bounded context, will end up being this, 2 fields over here, 2 fields over there, 3 fields over there, this one other thing over there. It's going to be all over the shop, basically. It's going to be distributed everywhere. The concept of a user, like the concept of a stock or warehouse or things like that. So keep that in mind. It's like it really helps. And the other thing is, if you're doing synchronous communication between components, you really want to rethink your strategy. Yeah? So if you're doing RPC, remote procedure calls, RESTful, I know RESTful sounds very cool and hype and all that, but it's still me opening a connection from me to another thing. And every time that other thing doesn't respond, I'm fucked. Excuse my language. So I'm sitting there like a dead duck calling this service and it's not answering. And what happens? This other service is trying to call me as well to tell me why I'm not calling this other service that it, and so on and so forth. Yeah, happens? Have you seen this crash ever? It's this great domino effect, you know, the whole system just crashes. And what it is, it's all yourself doing a denial of service attack to yourself, yeah? It's like all because this one thing started going slow, this other thing goes slow, this other thing goes slow as well, and all that. So if you're using RPC, or if you're doing the microservices thing and you're doing RESTful or direct synchronous calls to other things in order to change state, you're in trouble. Think your strategy again. I think using queues and messages, doing asynchronous communication will work 100 times better. And, you know, obviously that brings us to kind of pub/sub, publish, subscribe. So basically, if something important happens, I will send, you know, publish an event in my system. That event will allow me to reconcile my actions in other places of the system and so on. Remember, CQS, command query separation, SRP, single responsibility. Anybody does that here? Extreme programming? Yay! Kind of. Yeah, we all do it kind of. It's okay, at least we try. Clean code, again, if you're into extreme and all that, this is those are the basics. And again, align all your other things with those bounded contexts. Yeah, so teams, you know, align them somehow to your bounded context. The repositories, yeah, so you don't want coupling, code coupling either, and the business segments. So make sure that, you know, it makes sense for the business to have those different segments. And don't forget your stakeholders, because they're the guys who pay your salary. And I know we don't think of, you know, we don't think of them as being important, but they're the ones who keep you alive. And it won't be perfect. Accept it. You know, live with the imperfect, the imperfect world. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Be happy that nothing is perfect in this world. If you want to learn more, there's a link here. I'll publish this slide somewhere, and you'll be able to, but you can get a couple of free lessons from Udi's. Udi is the creator of N-Service Bus, sorry, and the CEO in particular. But he does an amazing course about distributed systems, and I think, you know, if you want to learn a little bit more, get a little bit more into that, there's a link there. At least gives you a little bit of touch and a window into this world. Thank you very much. And I'll take, I'll be in the, I know that's lunch now, but yeah. I'll be in the room for questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're right.